Overall profit in an industry is maximized when the industry functions as one single monopoly. Profit falls when the firms in the industry behave as Cournot competitors. It falls even further when they behave as Stackelberg competitors, and it vanishes completely when they behave as Bertrand price competitors. Firms in an oligopolistic industry therefore have an incentive to collude with one another and behave as a single monopoly. When firms enter such a collusive agreement, we will say that they have formed a cartel, and will show here that while the firms have every incentive to sign such an agreement, they individually also have an incentive to cheat on the agreement, thus undermining the agreement and unraveling the cartel. Suppose an oligopolistic industry has two firms, and the two firms get together and decide to behave as a single monopoly. They then face a downward sloping demand curve, and the marginal revenue curve, as always, begins at the same vertical intercept but has twice the slope. The two firms also have constant marginal cost. When forming their cartel agreement to behave as a single monopoly, the two firms will then set quantity at the monopoly quantity in order to be able to charge the monopoly price. The cartel agreement will also specify how much of that overall monopoly quantity will be produced by firm 1 and how much will be produced by firm 2. For the sake of simplicity, let's suppose the cartel agreement specifies that firm 1 will produce half the monopoly quantity and firm 2 will produce the other half of the monopoly quantity. If the cartel increased its output, it would have to lower its price and would therefore lose profit on the XM goods that it previously was able to sell at the higher price. But the cartel would also gain profit from the additional quantity that it sells at the lower price. XM is the profit maximizing output level for the cartel because the shaded blue area is just a bit smaller than the shaded magenta area, meaning that if the cartel produced a little bit more, the gain in profit from more production is less than the loss in profit from the fact that price has to be lowered. This is true from an overall cartel perspective, which is why the cartel agreement specifies the monopoly quantity as the quantity that should be produced by the firms in the cartel agreement. But if you are an individual firm in the cartel agreement, you face different incentives. If you think about cheating and producing above your production quota, you get all the gains from the additional production because you get to sell those additional goods, but you incur only half the losses in profit that arise from the fact that price has now to be lowered. While limiting output to the monopoly quantity is therefore profit maximizing for the cartel overall, each firm has an incentive to produce above the production quota that would get the cartel to produce the monopoly quantity. We can illustrate the same incentive in a slightly different way in panel B. Here, we begin with the market demand curve and assume that firm 1 is producing its production quota of half the monopoly quantity. If we then subtract what firm 1 is producing, we get the residual demand curve that firm 2 is facing once we take into account the production by firm 1. As with any linear demand curve, the magenta residual demand curve gives rise to a marginal revenue curve for firm 2 that begins at the same vertical intercept but has twice the slope. Marginal cost intersects the green demand curve at twice the monopoly quantity, which means it intersects the residual magenta demand curve at 1.5 times the monopoly quantity. This implies that the residual marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost at 3/4 of the monopoly quantity. The profit maximizing production level for firm 2, given that firm 1 is sticking by its cartel production quota of half the monopoly quantity, is therefore to produce 3/4 the monopoly quantity, and not half the monopoly quantity, which is firm 2's production quota under the cartel agreement. The firms in the cartel agreement then face a classic prisoner's dilemma. Each firm, regardless of what the other firms do, has an incentive to cheat and produce more than the production quota assigned to it by the cartel agreement. But since everyone has an incentive to cheat, and therefore everyone does cheat, we end up with the Cournot equilibrium that doesn't require a cartel agreement. All firms would be better off than they are in a Cournot equilibrium if no one cheated. But not cheating can't be enforced unless there's some enforcement mechanism that the cartel can employ.